Okay, I see us. There we are. All right, welcome, everyone. It looks like we will dive right on in. It looks like we are visible over on LinkedIn. Welcome, everyone, to our live stream. We've got Teach for Poland and Teach for All on the call today to discuss measuring holistic student outcomes. And we've got a lot of exciting things to touch on the call. But before we do that, I'd like to start with a few introductions, and then we'll dive right into the agenda. My name is Alexis Ramos, and I work on Alumni Network and Impact Measurement at Teach for Poland. And joining us today from Teach for All is Robbie Dean. He is the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Network Learning. Hi, Robbie. Did I miss anything?
That's wonderful, Alexis. So happy to be here and to celebrate this exciting report from Teach for Poland on student holistic outcomes measurement. And good morning to everyone from Washington, D.C.
It's quite early over there, is it not?
It's all good. I'm a morning bird over here.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I'm going to just change our screen really quickly. Yep. All right. So, just to go through the agenda for today, we are going to start off by talking a little bit about the Teach for All network, what it is for those who are new here and who may not know. And then we're going to dive into the meat of our discussion today. We're going to learn a little bit about what holistic student outcomes are and talk about how we could potentially measure those. And then we'll talk a little bit about triangulation, at which point we will jump into Teach for Poland's pilot when it comes to measuring holistic student outcomes. And at the end of the hour, we'll have a few minutes left for some Q&A from our audience. Or you can ask the questions in the chat, or Robbie and I will have a little bit of a back and forth if we have time. All right. So, Robbie?
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. So to frame up our discussion, I'd like to share a little bit about Teach for All. Teach for All is a global network with its core purpose and vision that every child has the potential for a brighter future, but that around the world, millions of children don't have access to the education, support, and opportunities that they need to be able to fulfill this potential. And so we are a global network, as you'll see on the next slide, of more than 62 different network partner organizations with more than 35 prospective partners that are all working together to develop collective leadership of systems leaders and of teachers from across different countries, with Teach for Poland being a focal point for our discussion today. All of these different organizations are also working to develop a new paradigm of education that promotes holistic student outcomes development so that we might be able to develop the leaders that we need of a better future. And so in this discussion, we're really going to talk about what we measure is what we care about and what matters to us, about what are the skills and the leadership qualities of students that we must be able to develop as teachers, as systems leaders, as educational professionals, and as parents in order to see this vision fulfilled. And so excited to be here to kind of celebrate this seminal report from Teach for Poland. And I'll pass it back to Alexis, who will share a little bit about our agenda today.
Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, Robbie. We are going to move right along. Thank you for that introduction to Teach for All and what we're all trying to do here. We're moving on to the next part of our discussion, which is about holistic student outcomes. What are they and why should we measure those outcomes? Why is that important? I know a lot of the time we tend to focus measurement, especially in the education space, on academic achievement. And so what do we mean when we talk about holistic student outcomes, and why are they important to measure? And I'll throw that back to you, Robbie.
Great. So I think the question of why, the answer that we provide is that we see that many education systems need to be transformed and are designed with an outdated purpose in mind to develop rote learning and specifically mastery of different academic skills and content. And what we're seeing in trends, both from PISA and the UN and other national and international surveys and assessments is that the world is really starting to fall behind in terms of learning loss. More than 80% of countries that have measured recently post-pandemic academic performance are actually experiencing learning loss today. And this is due to many factors. But one important factor, I think, is that there is currently in the discussion a very false dichotomy between developing foundational literacy and numeracy skills or mastery of different academic skills and holistic student outcomes. And by holistic student outcomes, we mean student agency, well-being, awareness, and connectedness, essential skills for students to thrive in the 21st century. And too often, I think policymakers and sometimes even researchers can view numeracy skills and literacy skills as precursors to developing a set of social and emotional learning skills, whereas the most recent research and meta-analyses, particularly in the past year, have really shown that developing holistic outcomes improves academic outcomes, so that both of these are quite complementary. And so I think what we want to talk about is, if we know that holistic student outcomes development and supporting teachers to develop holistic outcomes, then we must be able to measure it with some validity and reliability, and to ensure that teachers have the skills that they need and the data and feedback to be able to improve on their practice to help foster these outcomes. And so we believe that measurement is a key part in the paradigm shift toward holistic student outcomes development, so that we can improve learning and ensure that all children are growing as leaders of a better future. And so I wanted to highlight just a few promising practices in social and emotional learning that we're starting to see in terms of measurement. And we'll touch on a few of these in more specificity later on the call. But the first is data triangulation for formative purposes. We see strength in our network where partners and teacher development organizations are using both student surveys, classroom observations, at times parental feedback, and other qualitative methods to measure student social and emotional learning. That one source of data is not enough to be able to tell a comprehensive picture. Often we make parallels with student academic assessments, which can rely on a single assessment to assess a student's academic performance. But in social and emotional learning, we really need the perspectives and the reference points of multiple different stakeholders that surround the child. A second that we're starting to see is improving how we analyze and interpret data on social and emotional learning. So we're starting to see more and more of our network partners using standardized effects reporting to be able to create comparable measures and statistics around what we see in terms of student outcomes measurement. Often when you have different scales, different constructs, that this can lead to the incomparability of different measures across social and emotional learning. But by aligning to a standard curriculum, often through the UNESCO's and UNICEF's Global Proficiencies Framework and others, we're able to create standardized effect sizes that allow us to kind of compare where different education systems are. The OECD has done an excellent job on this as well with their most recent study on social and emotional learning. And then finally, we are encouraging the use of action learning and impact evaluation within classrooms and schools to be able to discern what are some of those interventions and teacher training programs that are really leading toward impactful social and emotional learning. So we measure in order to get feedback on our programs and our program design, and the use of impact evaluation can actually accelerate our understanding of what works. Right now, the research is really centered on the Western Hemisphere. How are social and emotional learning interventions in the US and the UK showing different differential impact? And we believe that there is a need to allow other local organizations like Teach for Poland and others in the Teach for All network to really engage in research around impactful interventions and using some of the valid measures that they have been creating. One example of this that I would encourage everyone to take a look at is in Teach for Nigeria, where we recently partnered with an independent research firm, RAND organization, and the local government to conduct an impact evaluation of their program on holistic outcomes. And so this just gives you some inspiration for how we can use both measurement and research to better understand progress towards social and emotional learning.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Robbie. And I think this is very interesting. Teach for Poland, of these 3 practices that we have here, we are definitely focused, at least this year in our pilot year, on data triangulation for formative purposes. But the exciting thing is moving through and getting that real impact evaluation as we develop some of these practices and these systems is really exciting. And then I encourage anybody who's watching, if you have any questions, to feel free to ask them in the chat. We will come down and talk about them towards the end. But we'll move right along and talk a little bit about Teach for Poland over the past year. Robbie did mention Teach for Nigeria's work. And so we just wanted to share a little bit of a case study of what we've learned this year and why we think it's important. One of the things we focused on is, as I mentioned, triangulation. So we were focused on using multiple sources of perspectives on student social and emotional learning in order to get an idea of whether our students were actually growing in some of the leadership outcomes that we feel are important for leadership of tomorrow. And so that's what I'm going to dive right into. So first, as Teach for Poland, we had to think about our vision. We have a vision for what we would hope to be true one day. And that vision is that step by step, we're changing Poland for the better. And we aim for the day when all children will have an opportunity to discover and develop their true potential, because we believe that if students are able and children are able to fulfill their own abilities, they will be empowered to build a better country and a better future that they imagine for themselves and others. So both their families, their communities, their country, and the world. And so that was kind of a big vision, and is kind of a big vision to have. And so we had to think about, what kind of leaders do we need in order to make that vision true? And so we have kind of a tentative theory of leadership, and that's where all of this research comes from. And we think that the leaders of tomorrow need to have 3 things. They need to have a profound sense of possibility. They need to be committed to lifelong learning, and they need to have a human-centered approach. We believe that if young people and the leaders of tomorrow are able to develop these 3 things, or have these 3 characteristics, then we might move forward and create a better future for us all. But that's also quite big. And so we had to get down and create a little more detail here. What does it mean if you were to have a sense of possibility, if you are committed to lifelong learning, if you are human-centered? And we outlined several competencies, or key competencies, that we believe or hypothesize fall into these 3 leadership qualities. And they're here on the screen, and as you can see, there are many. And so we decided to prioritize sense of possibility in our pilot this year. And therefore, we were measuring 6 competencies, or 5: agency, responsibility, persistence, self-belief, and problem solving. And so we went about thinking, how could we measure these 5 competencies this year? And that resulted in the development and pilot of 3 different tools. The first is our student survey, which was administered to 1,097 students in Poland. It was a self-report survey where students were asked to agree or disagree with a series of statements related to the previous competencies. And then we had a participant survey. So that was for our teachers in the classroom, where they were asked to reflect on the development of their students' competencies. And this was a Likert scale survey, which also had a qualitative component. And we had 23 of our participants complete that survey. And then we had a lesson observation tool in which our tutors or coaches were able to observe a classroom and capture a snapshot of what student indicators were being exhibited in the classroom. And we had 21 lesson observations. And this is our version of triangulation, is we have multiple different sources of data that we're attempting to measure the same competencies and the same indicators. So I want to share what came out of that and why that was super important. There were a couple of trends that appeared after conducting all of these data collection tools and implementing those this year. The first is, and I think this is the reason triangulation is so important, is that sometimes there is a discrepancy between student and teacher perceptions, and that was definitely true for us. So one of the pitfalls when it comes to self-report surveys, when people are asked to report on what they believe about themselves, is it might be a little bit different from what others might see them exhibiting on a daily basis. And so that held true for us at Teach for Poland. There was a discrepancy between what teachers saw of their students in developing those student outcomes and how students felt about those outcomes. And then that's where we come in with our third leg of this triangulation approach, is what are we actually seeing in classrooms in our lesson observations? Are those confirming, or are they further changing the reality of student development and some of these competencies? And in many cases, and in a few of our competencies, lesson observations did confirm teacher perceptions of student development of those competencies. Another trend that was quite apparent is that certain indicators that we originally had as a team decided were a pretty important part of what should be seen in the classroom were either not observed or deemed not applicable to the lesson at hand. So that was a very interesting outcome. And actually, I will touch more on that and why that makes this triangulation even more important. And then we'll talk about a very particular data point that resulted out of our student survey, and that has to do with making mistakes and how students perceive making mistakes and their self-awareness. So I'll go into more detail in all four of those. And I'm going to go into more detail by using an example. Because we have so many competencies and we have so many outcomes and we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to focus on one of our indicators that falls under self-belief. And so we asked a question to our 1,000 students, is when you make a mistake, do you believe that this means that you are not smart? And over 40% of our students answered yes. When I make a mistake, I think this means that I am not smart. When we asked our teachers whether their students believe or are able to believe that they are not smart when they make a mistake, 48% of our teachers agreed that their students have that perception. So this was an indication of an alignment between what student self-perception is and what teachers are viewing at the same time. And so that has to do, that's a huge, being able to make a mistake, learn from it, move on, is a big part of self-belief and self-confidence. And that is one of the competencies that we had under the sense of possibility outcome. And so what does this mean? So then we had to take a look. If we want to strengthen self-belief in classrooms, then, and we believe that being able to bounce back and move on and do things differently after a mistake is a big part of developing that competency, we should see certain things in the classroom, we think. We should see students continue to engage and participate in classrooms after making an error. We should see the ability of reflecting, so articulating what went well and what could be improved after some sort of a mistake or error. And then we should see some indicators of forging a path forward. In other words, being able to articulate what could be done differently in order to succeed the next time. And so we would be looking for some of these behaviors in our classrooms to see if that was taking place. And this is where it gets very, very interesting. So when it came to making mistakes, we were looking at an indicator in our classrooms. When students make a mistake, for example, they answer a question incorrectly, they continue to participate and engage in class. We have high engagement in about 26% of our lesson observations, meaning most students who make a mistake continue to engage in class, they continue to participate, continue to raise their hands. And then we have moderate engagement in 4.3% of our classrooms, and 8.7% of our classrooms we have low engagement, where fewer than 20% of students bounce back. But we see that in 60% of our classrooms, that measure either did not apply or was not observed at all, which is interesting. And I'll get back to why in a moment. We also had an indicator that when students receive feedback, they're able to articulate what went well or what could be improved in the project, assignment, or circumstance. Now, this is hard to see in every class, but should it be in every class? And that's part of the question that we're grappling with as we move forward. In 13.7% of classes observed, most students who received feedback were able to articulate what went well and what could be improved. And I would imagine had the environment in which they could articulate those things. And in 86% or closer to 87%, that indicator was either not observed or did not apply. And finally, so after we have bounce back, is this forging a path forward. When students make a mistake on a test, project, answering a question incorrectly, they could articulate what they could do to improve on the next attempt. And in this case, in almost 96% of our classes, this was not observed or it did not apply to the classroom. And so I think I want to bounce this back to Robbie really quickly just to keep it going. In your opinion, what does this make you think about when we have these three factors?
It makes me think a lot about how this data is resonating with teachers, right? What are the conversations that teachers are having with their support system around what are the strategies that I might be able to employ to instill more social emotional learning? When we don't observe it, we don't actually know if it's because the teacher doesn't have the skill or has the knowledge of how to employ that. So it's really about the conversation and the self-reflection that a teacher can have to think about how might I do something differently when this comes up again with one of my students, when they make a mistake and they stop to engage. How do I make sure that they bounce back and reflect? Those are the types of conversations that I think can be more naturally spurred by data. And what we're trying to instill across our network is a use of information like this to have really critical reflections on how I can improve my teaching practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes us organizationally ask a lot of questions as well, especially because we had that alignment with teacher perceptions and student perceptions. And it's also important to keep in mind that lesson observations don't happen every day. It's just a snapshot of what happens in a moment. So it's by no means the hard and fast, result. And so let me see if this is working. Yeah. So here are some of the questions that we are now thinking about. And this is just one example, this example of making mistakes, which was the most interesting student survey results or student survey responses we got from our students is, okay, so we have these three pieces of data and we see some alignment, and then there is this alignment. So what's happening in our classroom, and we see what's not happening in our classroom. So we have to ask ourselves, do we think that these indicators that we've outlined as a team or observable actions are important to see in their classrooms? And if yes, are they appropriately aligned with the competency of self-belief, which falls under an important competency for sense of possibility? And if so, why are they not observed or deemed not applicable to the lessons observed? Could this be a matter of how the indicator is formulated in our tool? Should this indicator be observable in most observations or not? Is it an area of focus for our teachers? Is it an area of focus for our leadership development program? And how do we adapt our program to support teachers in these areas so that we might see these things in the classroom if we think they're important? And I might argue being able to, reflect on my mistakes, see what went wrong, set out a plan of action for how to do it differently. That might be something that teachers could practice in their classrooms just by asking questions, follow-up questions, and why do you think you got that answer? There's a lot of techniques, so we're not here to get into techniques, but yeah, so these are the questions that we're kind of thinking about. I just want to check in with Robbie. Is there anything you want to add to that before I move forward?
No, I think this is a really comprehensive kind of logistical way to think about it. I think that one other question I have is how are teachers' mindsets related to these particular questions in social and emotional learning skills? Do teachers have the kind of alignment with the purpose of developing these skills? Because when teachers have stronger alignment and mindsets, that part of my work is to help support the development of these skills, and I have the agency and the capability of supporting the development of those skills, they're more likely to engage in those types of practices. And that's an important part of how we view our teaching as collective leadership framework, which really focuses a lot on how do we cultivate the lenses or the mindsets of our teachers too. So that's another question I would ask myself.
Oh yeah, that's a great one. Absolutely. Um, I would ask about this teaching as collective leadership more, but maybe we can come back to that in a moment. And
Yeah.
I think this just kind of goes to what you were just saying. This reflection, which is the only reason we engage with collecting data, is to help us reflect on that data and think about what we could do differently, whether we should do things differently or not. And so I myself was a teacher and a participant in a Teach For program. And so I might ask myself, what practices can I implement in my classroom that would develop a growth mindset and a culture of error? And we mean not that like everyone should make errors all the time, but rather develop an environment where making mistakes is seen as a growth opportunity in order to build student self-belief and contribute to their sense of possibility. That's what I would think about as a teacher. As a tutor or a coach, how can we support our teachers to recognize the indicators of a growth mindset and a culture of error in the classroom, and then really develop those skills to support students in developing these, and what practices can be implemented in the classroom to develop these? At an organizational level, we're thinking about how can our program accelerate the development of growth mindset and culture of error for both participants and our students. So how do we see that play out with teachers and then moving onward to students? Ooh, yes. And then at a school level, I might think about how does our school culture contribute to the development of a growth mindset and a culture of error? What could we do to accelerate the growth of these in our students so that 40% of them don't believe that when they make a mistake, it means that they're not smart? And then parents could potentially ask themselves, how am I developing this in my children so that when they make a mistake, they don't think it means that they're not smart, but rather there's just so much more to learn. Yeah, so that's at different levels what I might be thinking about. Okay. So, challenges and lesson learned. So, we piloted these tools over this past academic year. We were able to implement all three of the tools one time in this academic year, and we learned a lot of things. And there's a lot more to learn from and a lot of ways to grow. And a lot of these things we've touched on so far. But one of the first lessons learned and challenges is having alignment and training. So, ensuring that all parties understand the definitions and the surveys and the forms in the same way. That can never be completely perfect, especially when you're surveying thousands of people, for example, but to do your best to be able to do so. And having a shared understanding of why we're collecting data at all levels, both from our coaches and our teachers and even our students. Why are we taking the survey? Why is it important? One of the questions or the challenges that we have that I hope maybe Robbie, you'll be able to come in and share your insight on this when it comes to capturing lesson observation data. Because we're not in classrooms every day, we're not getting a completely holistic look at what an everyday in this classroom looks like. We're just getting these little snapshots. And so, how do we count data that we're seeing that may or may not come up in every class or most classes? Now, the indicators I just talked about, some would argue those should be coming up in every class. But there are others that are less frequent. For example, when it comes to indicators related to resolving conflict, we're not looking to see that there's conflict in every classroom that we walk into, right? So how do we weigh those sort of indicators in our snapshot where we're collecting this data? I don't know if
Right.
I.
No, I think that does a great point. There's some of these things that we hope are happening seldom in classrooms and that they aren't observed. But the question is how do we know whether the teachers are engaging in certain strategies when things come up? And so part of the lesson observation strategy of Teach for All and teaching as collective leadership is a teacher self-reflection tool that teachers use periodically to kind of think about what are some of the objectives and growth areas that they would like to grow professionally in terms of new strategies, document those over time, and have conversations with their coach or those who are conducting the observations at different points in time, and to create kind of a culture where this is really focused on supporting the professional development of the teacher in a supportive environment and to enable more student growth, right? So I think that the role that observations play is a formative use as opposed to as an evaluative tool. Does the does the teacher do this or not? And if he doesn't or she doesn't do this, then that is not what we hope to see. That's not the frame of reference that we hope is being used for observations. Rather, how can we provide agency to the teacher to be able to both learn about techniques and strategies that will be effective to develop social emotional learning, how to equip them with some of these same skills, right? Reflective skills. I made a mistake. How am I going to progress? Because when a teacher is able to demonstrate those skills in action, students are more likely to absorb them. And then three, making sure that this is a supportive environment for teachers and coaches to talk about how can I make some improvements in my classroom, and how can I actually try new things in my classroom that maybe no one else has tried in my country or in my school, and what can I learn about that? And that's what we call action learning, when a teacher is actually becoming a researcher in their classroom and coming up with new strategies and sharing them back with others.
I love that action strategy where teachers become researchers in their classroom, just try different things, and then get a gauge on what the outcome was, which is what we're trying to do here. And especially your comment about it's not evaluative, right? It's more about what can we learn and then apply, and then learn and then apply, as opposed to looking for a specific result. And if that benchmark isn't met, it means something's wrong. And as we know, a lot of these competencies and the outcomes that we're looking at, these are things that take a lifetime to develop, right? To develop a sense of possibility, we're always going through different challenges and different experiences that help develop our sense of possibility. And so with the students we have in front of us and the time that we have, how can we support them as best as possible to help develop the competencies in order to have a strong sense of possibility? And so some of the other lessons learned, I've got two more here, is we want to go back now that we've done the pilot and evaluate, are the indicators or behaviors that we were looking for at the survey level, both student, teacher, and lesson observations, are they aligned with the competencies, the 5 competencies that we just discussed? And then making sure that there is a clear understanding of what those competencies mean. We obviously have had a lot of discussions, those were co-created, but also circling back now that we have the data, that also helps us to reflect on the data a little bit, and maybe we could either formulate things a little bit differently, and make any changes. And that's kind of the work that we're going through now. And then the other thing that we are thinking about going back to is, okay, we have these competencies. We have a year of data. How can we then strengthen the leadership development program to build those competencies in our participants that would then accelerate the building of those competencies in our students, who one day will make our vision true, we hope. So those are the things we're thinking about as an organization. And here's what we're thinking about in terms of moving forward, things that maybe didn't happen in our pilot, but we'd love to incorporate. And the first is involving parents and communities in this process. What do parents think are important for their children? What competencies do they believe are important for their children to develop into the kind of leaders that would create a better future for themselves, their families, and their country? We're thinking about how we can do that. How can we involve communities in building this process out as well? We're also thinking about, and I just touched on this, but how can we as an organization even more align the program to accelerate the growth of these competencies? And we're hoping in this next year, rather, we're not hoping, we're going to in this next year, we're going to increase, after we've edited some of the things that might need some changes, we are going to increase the frequency on a few of these tools The first, we did our student survey and it went really well. 1,097 students have spoken, and you can check out that report on the Teach for Poland webpage as well as on the LinkedIn page. But this year we're going to do it 2 times. We're going to do it at the start of the year and at the end of the year so that we can have some comparative data. We are also going to increase the frequency of our lesson observations to twice a semester. And then we are going to increase our participant survey so that it's twice a year, at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. And that should also help us understand whether the targeted interventions that we are employing throughout the year, whether they're having any sort of an impact. And what we'd like to do is eventually, we'd like to see if schools would be interested in participating in our student survey. If they're interested in understanding student development of sense of possibility, how they feel when they make a mistake. And so that's something we're hoping to launch this year. Yes, and that is it.
Amazing, Alexis. Thank you so much for these great, exciting action plans on Teach for Poland's end. It's very exciting to see. I had a question for you, if I might ask.
Right, yeah.
After kind of reflecting on some of this, you talked a lot about how can your organization think about the next steps? How are you involving teachers in that process, those that kind of went through this pilot to get their feedback on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great question. So when we say involving parents and communities, I think one of the things that falls into that is how do we get some of our teachers on board as well? Not just teachers, but teachers, school directors, if they're interested, to help us not only make our tools better, make our tools stronger, but be more engaged in helping each other to develop as well. Because if we are thinking about collective leadership as opposed to just leader from the top, leader as one, but rather we're all working together to create this change, then we need to be able to take on and include all of the different voices. So the plan is to create a working group around some of these tools, which would incorporate members of our team, which would incorporate members, our teachers, hopefully some school directors, if they're interested, as well as reaching out and see if we got any parents who might be willing to be involved with this process. And we will move forward in that way.
Awesome.
Okay. And then I think there is a little bit of a delay, in case I'm not seeing it here in the chat, but I will refresh it. If there are any questions that you'd like to place in the chat, I will just double check and see that they're coming through. And then I did kind of want to talk about, I had a question for Robbie. When you look at sort of this data triangulation, this measuring of impact, when it comes to social emotional learning, holistic outcomes. Right now, Teach for Poland, what we did was quite small. It was at a small scale. It was our pilot year. How can this, or how has this in the Teach for All network, if at all, how has it impacted the system in any way? Are there cases in which some of this outcomes measurement has resulted in changes at a school, community, or local government level? And what has that been like?
Oh, yeah. This is a great question, and I'm excited to share a really interesting case study on this. So the quick answer is yes, there have been certain systems-wide changes that have occurred because our network partners are such advocates for holistic student development, and which will lead me to a question back to you after this, Alexis. But in Enseña Peru, the organization, or Teach for Peru, the organization was working in a province called Ancash, is still placing and working in Ancash and supporting teachers there. And they created an ecosystem model where both teachers are supporting students as classroom teachers and are engaging in professional development with other teachers in the region. The emphasis of the Enseña Peru teachers on holistic student outcomes development became almost a proof point for how important it is to develop these skills. And we're able to demonstrate through an impact evaluation study that the Enseña Peru model in Ancash actually had accelerated impact on student academic performance. And so they were able to take this example and the research to go back to the government, to the regional provincial government, to share that there is an importance to developing and measuring holistic student outcomes, and are now currently engaging in a system-wide effort to measure social and emotional learning. And so it just goes to show that by demonstrating that locally developing holistic student outcomes does in fact accelerate learning gains through research, through measurement, that you can really achieve a lot at the policy level. And it also is a case study in how to build coalitions and movements with different stakeholders around this. And so my question back to you is, tell us a little bit about the ecosystem that you're working in Poland. How is holistic student outcomes development viewed at the systems level? What are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see in terms of developing these types of outcomes?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to Poland, I think it's all opportunity. I think the reaction to the student survey report, which kind of shared how our 1,000 students answered to all of these questions, was met with a lot of curiosity at all levels. So we are seeing a lot of interest. I don't think measuring social emotional learning is something that is necessarily at the forefront of people's minds, because we're very much focused on academic achievement. And so something that has become a really big topic of conversation before our survey was student well-being, as something that is particularly challenging in our context, where we do see increasing rates of suicide and depression. And so definitely there's a lot of conversation and a lot of interest. And so we are hoping that we will be able to have a coalition, as you mentioned, of those who are really interested in helping support students to develop these social, emotional learning outcomes in order to improve well-being in our students. And of course, if our students are feeling good and confident and they are persistent and they believe in themselves, we hope that they will create a better future for themselves and their families. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity. We are new. We are young, and this was a pilot year. So we're incredibly hopeful, and we have a very strong sense of possibility about this, because I do think that most people, including our governments, are looking out for our students and want them to be well-rounded and being leaders of their own lives.
Makes a lot of sense, Alexis. One thing that came up as we were talking about this is that in addition to kind of the insights around holistic student outcomes development, Teach for All is really pioneering the space of systems transformation too. And so there are a lot of really great insights from a recent report that we released called The Missing Piece, which kind of documents cases of different network partners across the Teach for All network leading toward this new paradigm of education that really is to transform student leadership. And so there's a few different insights on like how to convene, how to build coalition, how to align on purpose with kind of systems leaders that I think could be quite useful for the audience to take advantage of too. So I will figure out how to post that into the chat for folks.
Sounds great. Yes, and I will also we'll leave that resource, and we'll also leave the student survey report. Oh, I see that in the private chat, that I can move it over here in the live chat for those who are interested. Let me see if that went through. I think it did go through. Yes, it did. Okay, lovely. And that, again, is The Missing Piece, Developing Collective Leadership to Transform Education. That is what has been shared in the chat. And we will also make sure to share that on the Teach for Poland LinkedIn page as well, for those who are interested, as well as the student survey report that was just published about a month ago by Teach for Poland. I don't see any questions coming through the chat. I'm going to leave it for a second or two more, but I think we are right on time. Oh, okay. So we do have a question, actually. The question is from Olivia. Do we have any similar statistics regarding culture of error and growth mindset from other countries? Do we know where Poland is being placed on the world's map? Is there any similar data we can compare based on the culture differences? Ooh.
This is a tough one. To my knowledge, there isn't a way that we can compare Poland's data currently with other countries. And that's something that we really need to strive for as a community, is in a global education community, is to help develop holistic student outcomes measures that will enable cross-country comparison and to be able to help us learn from the great examples that are happening in countries that are really excelling in this. The OECD study on social and emotional learning is one of the first to use different country examples of where different countries are in terms of social and emotional learning, including growth mindset. So I would encourage a review of that paper. It is limited to only a few different countries and cities in particular. But at the Teach for All Network, we have in our vision for the next several years, how can we help develop measures that are consistent and comparable so that we can enable better learning about what's working in different countries and how we can accelerate the growth of others.
Yeah, that's great. And I think one thing about I think Robbie answered that question fully. I just wanted to make a quick comment about culture of error and growth mindset. So growth mindset, there's a lot of data on, and culture of error is just something Teach for Poland pulled when we saw that so many of our students felt like making a mistake means that they're not smart, and we saw that teachers tend to have similar rates of agreement that that's what they see coming out of their students, or at least in the way that the teacher question was formulated, that they can't say that students don't think this, right? That they might in fact think that. Is that developing a culture of error is actually a technique that I pulled on how to develop a classroom and environment in which students feel that it's okay to make mistakes. And so I don't necessarily know that it's something we could compare across countries. However, definitely the growth mindset is something, as Robbie mentioned, that there has been a lot of work on, a lot of studies on, and we can use kind of the tools that are utilized to build that culture of error in our classroom. Okay, and I will just refresh once more and see if anything else comes through. Otherwise, it looks like there are no more questions. So it looks like we will wrap this live today. Thank you so much, Robbie, for joining us to have this conversation about measuring holistic student outcomes.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and congratulations on this report and pioneering measurement of these outcomes and prioritizing it among teachers in your network and among Poland. So I'm so excited to see what the future years have in store. And thank you to the public who joined us to learn about this and who are all interested in how to advance social emotional learning across their own contexts. We're very excited to stay in touch on this.
Likewise. And be sure to follow Teach for Poland's LinkedIn page, as well as the Teach for All network on LinkedIn, if you're interested in getting more information on any of these topics. Thank you for those of us who joined us today. And I think that's a wrap. Have a wonderful day.